The following excerpt is taken from Chapter 13, The Falcon's Prey. I will begin reading on page 310. During the first weeks of July, Natasha's nocturnal absences from home became so frequent that house guest Federico Beltran Masses suggested to his friend Rudy he should hire a private detective to follow her. In Spain, he said, that is exactly what any man in his situation would do. When George heard Beltran Masses' suggestion, he told Rudy in no uncertain terms that hiring a detective to trail Natasha would only result in disaster. But Rudy's mind was made up, and George was dispatched to hire a detective. When Rudy received the detective agency's first report of his wife's covert activities, George's worst fears realized. On that fateful night of July 17, 1925, most women would have gone berserk to hear Rudolph Valentino's voice on the telephone at 2 o'clock in the morning. Bee Ullman just yawned and mumbled to her sleeping husband, "Rudy's on the phone." Telephone calls from Rudy in the dead of night were not an uncommon occurrence in the Ullman household, but this was more than the usual rude awakening. "She isn't home yet, George," Rudy spit out his words, "and when she gets here, I'm going to kill her." George mumbled a few words of reassurance and hung up the phone. He quickly pulled on a pair of golf knickers, an old sweater, and some tennis shoes, and hurried out of the house. As he backed his car down the driveway and onto Foothill Road, he just hoped he would arrive in time. As he sped down Sunset Boulevard, he regretted ever agreeing to hire the detective agency. Rudy shared the agency's first report with him that afternoon. A lengthy account reporting how Natasha spent the afternoon alone with a cameraman in a private bungalow. Just as George feared, Rudy became so enraged by the contents of the report that he began drinking heavily and worked himself into a full-blown homicidal rage. Rudy knew the cameraman mentioned in the detective's report and also knew he was a married man with 4 children. When George turned his car into the Wedgwood Place driveway, he spotted Rudy pacing in the driveway. He caught the glint of a revolver in his hand and slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt in a spray of gravel. Without pausing to shut the car door, he headed straight for Rudy. "Give me that gun, goddammit, don't be an idiot." But Rudy put up a fight and continued yelling, "I'll kill her, George, I swear I'll kill her." The two men grappled for the weapon, but George, being the stronger of the two, quickly gained control of the .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. After shoving Rudy inside the house, George cocked the barrel of the gun to find that it was indeed fully loaded. As he slid the 6 bullets from the spinning chamber and slipped them into the pockets of his knickers, Rudy began lugging a large armchair across the darkened living room. He positioned the chair to face out the front window, and for the next hour he did nothing but sit staring straight ahead, half listening to George's calculated small talk. It was around 3 a.m. when the long beams of headlights swept across the living room wall. Natasha's car was pulling into the driveway. George ceased his banter, and careful not to set off the hair trigger seated in the easy chair, he said in a low voice, "Don't move, Rudy. You stay right here." Rudy did not flinch. When George appeared in the driveway to greet Natasha in the middle of the night, she acted as if nothing was amiss and commented on his sporty knickers and tennis shoes. "Aren't you the country gentleman, George?" she purred. Without saying a word, George escorted her into the foyer. But before he could warn Natasha about the imminent threat awaiting her inside, Rudy made his entrance, tearing down the stairs from a second-floor bedroom with another revolver in his hand. A scuffle ensued before Rudy surrendered his second loaded gun of the night. Facing his wife unarmed did nothing to diminish Rudy's rage, and when she strolled calmly past him to enter the living room, he stormed after her, demanding, "Where have you been? Tell me, where have you been?" Natasha dismissed her husband with a light excuse by explaining she'd only been matching frames at the studio. But before she could finish her sentence, Rudy raised his fist in the air and bellowed, "You dirty liar! You goddamn dirty liar!" Before George could make a move, Rudy leveled his clenched fist in a furious crack across Natasha's face. She absorbed the blow with a forced lack of reaction and continued with the explanation of her whereabouts in her silkiest voice. This only further infuriated Rudy, and he continued shouting, "I'll divorce you! I'll divorce you!" By then George had hurried off to the kitchen to retrieve ice and a towel for Natasha's bleeding and swelling mouth. When he returned to the living room, he found Rudy had turned his attention from beating his wife to a frantic and irrational discussion of a property settlement and immediate divorce. He ignored George's advice that neither of them were in any condition to sign a thing that night. But as Natasha pressed the ice pack against her reddened face, she assured George she was in complete agreement with Rudy. A property settlement was indeed the next order of business. She said she was through fighting and insisted he draw up some draft of a settlement immediately. With the promise of a property settlement temporarily diffusing the situation, George drove home to execute a rough document. Before he left, he took Rudy aside and advised him to sleep downstairs on the sofa and not get into bed with Natasha until things cooled down. Rudy nodded in agreement, and George headed home where he spent the remainder of the night laboring over a preliminary property settlement. Early the next morning, with the papers in hand, he drove back to Wedgwood Place. The alarmingly sunny sight that greeted him when he entered the Valentinos' home that morning caused his exhaustion to hit him full force. Rudy and Natasha were cooing affectionately over a cozy breakfast. They demonstrated little interest in George's sketchy property settlement and instead invited him to join them for coffee. After the baffling breakfast, Rudy took George aside to explain that soon after he left the previous night, he and Natasha reconciled and spent the entire night in bed together, making up. George was dumbfounded as he listened to what he perceived as evidence of Rudy's sheer gullibility. As Rudy went on and on claiming how Natasha explained to him that she had just been advising the married father of four on his marital problems, George knew it would not be long before he would see through his wife's obvious bluff. And just as he expected, it wasn't long before Rudy and Natasha's tumble-down marriage returned to its volatile worst. The source for this story is George Ullman's personal memoir that he wrote in 1975. I tried to keep it as close to the actual details that he relayed, down to the wardrobe he wore on that night. Thank you.